All right, so I was thinking about evolution and social conservatism. Now, in the United States, I believe that social conservatism has come to mean has lost its generality. Right? And let me say this for example. When I say Islam is socially conservative in the Middle East, on a cognitive level, you know that that is true. You know that it's true, cognitively, logically. But at an emotional level, it feels weird to say that. It feels weird to say that Islam in the Middle East is socially conservative, right? Because no, social conservatism means white Christians. That's what social conservatism means, right? Or when you look at the views of blacks regarding homosexuality, you might say, well, those are very socially conservative views. But it feels weird for most people. Now, the people watching this channel are not most people. So, if you're watching this channel, whether you're within my general proximity of beliefs, or you're on the far left, right? You're probably not a normal person, so anyway. But if you're a normal person, saying that Islam is socially conservative is weird, or saying that blacks regarding homosexuality that's a socially conservative belief, that seems weird, right? And the reason it seems weird is because at an emotional level, social conservatism has lost its generality. It's not generally used. It is used regularly to refer to white Christians. White Christians. White Christians are socially conservative. That is what social conservatism, it means Pat Robertson. It means Mike Huckabee. That's what social conservatism means. So, but if we regeneralize social conservatism, we can come up with a better understanding of what are the conservative beliefs. Now, there are epigenetic effects, okay? But when I visualize like at a genetic level, you have two things. First, you have basically your beads, or your alleles of the genes. Now, everyone has the same number of beads, the same, right? And each bead location does the same thing in each person, right? Between individuals and between groups and all that, right? But it's not. But everyone has their own little variations of these beads on their little bead chain, right? And that's like your DNA. And so everyone has a string of beads, and the epigenetic effects are not the beads themselves. The epigenetic effects are perhaps the rotations of the beads, right? Because when you rotate the beads, you'll get a little bit of a difference in expression in what expresses what where. You will get certain little hormone thingies that actually bond receptors. If you want to actually know what epigenetic effects are, you can go look that up. That's not what this video is about, and you shouldn't get it from me. But you have these epigenetic effects, and these epigenetic effects are just an effect on the beads that change the way the beads are expressed, but it doesn't change the beads themselves. See? And that's a key difference. And so, yes, epigenetic effects can have effect, but it's not going to turn you into a raccoon, right? Changes in epigenetic effects are not going to turn you into a raccoon, okay? What will turn you into a raccoon is successive generations of evolution, right, and gene recombination, right? That is what will turn you into a raccoon, not epigenetic effects. So there is a great... So certainly we can agree that epigenetic effects are at least that limited, right? But perhaps if you've played, say, Magic the Gathering or Pokemon, you will have an intuitive sense in those card games. You'll have an intuitive sense how much epigenetic effects matter, right? It is certainly possible, and it certainly happens all the time, that someone with an inferior hand can beat someone with or excuse me, with an inferior deck can beat someone with a better deck, right? And certainly that happens. You know, the way the cards are played can cause someone with worse cards to beat someone with better cards, right? And certainly the way the genes are expressed can cause someone with real. Well, you know, I'm just gonna go ahead and use loaded language. This is not a pure. This is not a. I know it's unscientific, but I'm just gonna do it for the sake of clarity. Someone with a crappier gene set through excellent epigenetic effects can end up with a higher IQ than someone with a better gene set who has really poor epigenetic effects. See? But the person with the better gene set has more upside, right? Because with him, okay, you reverse those epigenetic effects, you reserve those site bond thingies and histone rotations by whatever environmental things you need to do, and then he will have a higher IQ than someone whose epigenetic effects are already kind of maxed out. See? And so epigenetic effects can only explain so much, right? The person, right. Ultimately, the ultimate driver is going to be the genes themselves. The epigenetic effects are secondary. And another thing, epigenetic effects are already captured, or they're already. Right, we already have them. In terms of the old-timey heritability from twins, those, by their very nature, capture epigenetic effects. They're not able to separate epigenetic effects from environmental effects. Okay, they can't. Right, in fact, they can't even, because this is top-down heritability estimates. It can't be used to identify any genes, what genes are doing what. All it can do is say, because all it can do is say this much is innate heritable, right? This percentage of the variance is heritable, and this percentage of the variance is not due to heritable traits. Now, it's usually called the environmentality, right? But now we know that the environmentality can encompass both epigenetic and non-epigenetic environmental effects. Right. For example, just studying for a test can cause you to have a higher score on a test. Not really an IQ test. You're not really supposed to be able to study for it. Although there are study guides for IQ tests, which defeats the purpose of an IQ test. I mean, you can go if they're able to do that, and you're able to get an IQ of 150 or something. You basically just defeated. I mean, basically, IQ tests are now worthless for you. Congratulations. Because you basically, anyway. What was I saying? That was a very roundabout way to say. Anyway, if you look at public opinion on race differences, right? Are race differences attributable to innateness? I've seen polls on this, and it's about 5% of the population attributes differences between the races to innateness. At least 5% claim it, or are willing to say so to a pollster. How many actually believe it, how much higher is that? I don't know. I'm not willing to go much higher than that, but via speculation. So I'll just say 5%. And even if there are more closet, hereditarians, but aren't willing to say it to a pollster, well, that still supports my case of social conservatism, that this is a socially conservative belief. And if you want to say that this is not a socially conservative belief, well, then what would constitute a generally social conservative belief? Right? Yes, it's not Christian. Yes, it's not white Christian. Got it. But it has overwhelming public support. Right? The overwhelming, public says, right, all the races are equal in brain function, not necessarily size and shape, but function. Okay, so functional equality, one, and the majority of the public believes that. So that's the first point. The second point is that they are rabid and ravenous to people who are go against it, right? And I've talked about this before. previous videos, about how, if you are racist, quote unquote, then that is used to justify attacks on you, right? Oh, well, we can go ahead and bash this guy's brains out with a crowbar, but that's okay because he made some mean comments about blacks, and he used the nigger word while doing so. Right? He said a bunch of dumb niggers, or he said something. What's the difference between a black man and a pizza? A pizza can feed a family of four, right? Made some mean jokes about that, so therefore it's justified to, to kill this person, right? And so what you're dealing with there, right? You're not dealing with, response to crime, right? That's insane, right? Right. What you're dealing with there is a response to heresy, right? The crime is not the harm done, right? The crime is the thing in and of itself, self-referential sin of racism, right? And I know I'm talking about this before, and so I'm thinking about this in terms of evolution. Evolution. What we have here is you have in one era you have the creationists. Okay, so you have the creationists, right? They believe Bible, blah 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 blah. And during the era of creationists, of the biblical creationists, which was a very long era. I mean, it goes back to like the beginning of Christianity, basically. You had, I mean, they did science. They did lots of science. They did lots of science in biology, right? So, and these were all scientists making all sorts of scientific breakthroughs. I would say that most scientific breakthroughs to date have been done by creationists. These people were all creationists, or at least publicly so. So, and most of them were young Earth creationists. So you had that period of young Earth creationism. And then you move into a period of evolution, right? And you have and so at first you had an odd situation, well, it wasn't odd, right? The fact that we find it odd doesn't make it odd, okay? But you had a situation unlike today where you had the Christian, it was called Christian optimism. And the idea was that the British Empire, I don't know whether or not this was a public sentiment in the French Empire, though my guess is it would be even greater in the French Empire. But in the British Empire, there was a movement known as Christian optimism. And the idea was that the British Empire would be used to civilize the savages. Right? It would be to make these people in Africa an extension of Europe. Right, to be an extension of Britain, that they would act like British people, and they would be British. And much of the justification came from the Bible. Right, we are all sons of God. We were all created by God. We were all made in the image of the Creator. Right, and so these people in these foreign lands, these dark people, should all be made like us. Right, they should be made to have European civilization. Then came Darwin and Galton and the eugenicists and the scientific racialists, who said no, they're not like us. They're biologically distinct. Yes, they are human. And it was funny. Early on, there was a little bit of a debate whether or not to classify Africans as apes. Obviously, it didn't get very far, but that's what you had. You had and part of the classification of Africans as apes. One of the reasons it could not get very far is because Darwin, early on in that period, species, the clear delineation of they identified species as that which cannot be bred with another. So they had a very clear delineation of species back then, which was based on breeding. Of course, this gets into the problem of the ring species, but But at the time, that's how they defined species, as being able to breed. And the fact that Africans and Europeans could breed, basically, by early Darwinian standards, basically said that they were that was, you know, all the proof you would need to show that they were the same species. So that I think that's why the push to classify Africans as another species got basically nowhere. All they had to do was show a few mulattoes, and that was the end of that. So so but at the time, right? They assumed. Now they had a few IQ tests, and but the problem, I mean, the problem at that time with the IQ tests was massive environmental differences they had at the time, and so the usage of IQ didn't really come until later. They prefer to use things like brain size, and yeah, they prefer to use brain size because they could say this is the size of the brain, and they assume that the size of the brain, that was a mainly genetic thing. Nowadays, I believe IQ is a bit more appropriate to use because of the basic parity in cognitive environment that Africans and Europeans have. Now some people are going to say, well, what about the number of words exposed to blah 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 blah? That's not that has not. There have been early intervention studies. Okay, there have been adoption studies. As long as the child is exposed to 500 new words a year, that's the upper limit, right? African children are not, or African American children are not in a verbally impoverished environment, right? They're basically maxed out on that front, right? So that they're not. I mean, I go into this in race and IQ, and that's not the point here, right? The point here is evolution. Okay, so early on you had the creationists, then you had the early evolutionists who believed in racial disparity. Now, and that's something you can get into the actual studies and you can spend hours talking about that, which I do. But beyond that, there is just a kind of a pinch test, right? Because you had humanity starting in Africa. Now, the very early evolutionists believed humanity started in the Middle East, but we now know it started around East Africa, somewhere around Kenya today, and then spread out throughout the world and evolved in all these different ways. They evolved in all these different superficial ways in terms of, one would be, the skin color, right? That's, we also can tell differences in muscularity, body fat, and where the body fat is gained, size, height. We also know differences in, heart function, lung function. Another thing is carbohydrate metabolism. Like there's major disparities between the races in terms of their ability to digest carbohydrates. Another would be lactose, which is a specific type of carbohydrate, but I'm talking about general carbohydrate tolerance. There's that. So you have all these differences. Now, even if, let's just imagine, even if we don't have any evidence one way or the other regarding brain size and brain shape, what would be the odds of identical cognitive function between these groups? Maybe you want to say they're slight. Maybe you want to say they're very minor. Okay, that's one thing. Okay, but the idea that they're identical, well, that's, And moreover, let's say you say, okay, well, sure, the humans evolved in different, groups. You can call them races. I don't really believe race is a scientific term. Blah, 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 blah. The reason you think that is because you've heard that meme said a lot. And I know you think there's, oh no, it's because there's something behind it, but you never investigated what was behind it. And by that I mean, you heard Lewontin's fallacy, the continuum fallacy, and that was it, right? And you thought, oh, well, that must be it. Okay, anyway. So even if you didn't know anything regarding IQ or regarding any other measure, or one thing you could do is the reaction time tests, right? or or just the size and shape of the brains, right? If you didn't know any of that, right, it could go one way or the other. How would you say that they would all end up with cognitive equality? Right? That just seems like such a on just when you recognize two facts. One is evolution, Darwinian, and sort of random, right? Sort of random and what mutations that persist. Okay, we'll just say mutations that persist. So when you accept that, and you accept the idea that humans started in East Africa and then spread out from there, when you accept those two basic facts, the idea of cognitive equality seems almost like a really odd thing that would require a lot of evidence, right? That is in fact the extraordinary claim, right? Now, what we're dealing with, like if you go to say the Middle Ages and they say, oh, you want to say that God is not real? Well, that is an extraordinary claim that requires extraordinary evidence, right? And you're seeing kind of the same thing regarding evolution in humans, in the brain, in function. You're seeing that them say, oh, well, you want to say that they're not all equal? Well, that's an extraordinary claim that requires extraordinary evidence, right? And then if they're really dumb, like the really dumb ones, the actual scientists don't say this, but the dumb ones who don't, right? The really dumb ones will say, scientific consensus says that we're all equal in the brain, right? Or the races are all equal. The individuals can be different, but the races, they're all the same. Right? The real dumb ones will say that. The scientists generally won't, or if they do, they'll spend a very long time getting to that, right? Because I mean, there's a difference there. So, and so that's what you're seeing. And so when I'm looking at evolutionists today, what I'm thinking is that we're having kind of a weird transitional period, because evolution at its root is a very inegalitarian thing. Inegalitarian everywhere. Inegalitarian between the genders, if right. But more importantly, inegalitarian between the races. Right? Evolution is at root, it is a very racially inegalitarian idea. Because what is it saying? It's saying that humans, all life, any animal, right, including humans, spread throughout the world and evolve in various ways. The brain is matter, right? Mind is matter. So, right, the brain. I mean, the brain's just a machine. In fact, we're getting to a point with neural computing that we're starting to be able to mimic the basic primitives of the brain, right? It's not special, okay? It's a machine like muscle, right? It does a thing, right? Now, it happens to be super complicated, and it goes off in all sorts of different directions, which at a higher level produce something that appears qualitatively different, but it's not qualitatively different. That qualia is an illusion. Okay, the brain's a machine. So, and it's subject to evolutionary rules just like the rest of the body. If the rest of the body can be affected by evolution, right? Now, I don't know what proportion of the genome is dedicated to the brain. I don't know, but let's say a quarter of it is. Well, the idea that, I mean, it's just absurd to me. Now, one argument I've heard, and I was a bit flabbergasted that this argument would be made, and this is also more evidence that this idea of racial innate cognitive equality as a socially conservative thing is that in the fact that people with college degrees made this argument, right? And they made the argument that there would be no evolutionary advantage to stupidity, right? So all races have identical innate cognitive abilities because there's no evolutionary advantage to stupidity. Now, of course, individuals can be different because apparently between individuals there can be a cost benefit of more or less of what we call intelligence. But between groups, they all have to be the same because if a group, right? And so that is why what? That is why all life on the planet have brains the size of zeppelins. I mean, it's so. I hope I don't really need to explain that very much, and I think with most people you don't, because I mean we can see, hey, look, ants have really small brains. They must be a very unsuccessful animal. Bees, look at how small their brains are. They must not be very successful at all. You know? Like, I mean, so I'll just, leave that aside. So, but that is evidence, right? Because that was an argument made by Sophia Roon and Astria Aikau and Evogen. Right now, Evogen is not actually a college anything. In fact, by the time I saw his transcripts, I was actually further ahead in the biology series than he was. But right, which was so maddening because he was saying just a bunch of pop genetics, irrelevant pop genetic stuff, which was not wrong. Like what he was saying wasn't wrong, but it was totally irrelevant to what was being argued. But the audience didn't know that. So, anyway. But it was such a stupid argument. Like nowhere would such an argument ever fly, right? Let's say you did that with two different animals, right? Let's say you said, hey, look, this fox is smarter, this breed of fox, right? The northern silver-tailed wingleding fox is smarter than the southern red-tailed shoopadoop fox, right? And you said this fox appears smarter. We have little, we put them in a lab. We have little tests for object constancy. We do the mirror test. The northern fox passes the mirror test. The southern fox does not. Okay, or you do something like that. Some way to measure intelligence of the fox breeds, right? And then you say, and also the northern fox has a larger brain, especially a larger prefrontal cortex, blah, 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 blah. Okay, well, so what are we going to say? We're going to say, no, that can't be true because there wasn't enough time for the foxes to evolve apart, right? They've only had about 1.2 million years to evolve apart. That's not enough time, right? You could say with humans, there's only been about 200,000 years for the races to evolve apart. That's not enough time. And of course, there's never a definition of when it's enough time. Right? That's something that's not defined beforehand. Right? That is a standard invented and applied retroactively. Right? And you can sit here and pretend to deny it, but it's true. You know that 200,000 years is not enough time to evolve into separate races, or is not enough time for cognitive differences to evolve, right? Right, which first off, let's say that the brain constitutes about a quarter of the genome. Okay. Differences in the other 75% were able to evolve in that time. Okay, whatever the time was. Let's say it was only 100,000 years. Okay, let's lowball it. Okay, 100,000 years. In that time, all of these physical differences have evolved, okay, and that's in 75% of the genome. So why not cognitive differences in the other 25%, right? And the argument that it wouldn't evolve because that would be detrimental. Well, I mean, apply this standard to the rest of the body, right? Is it better to be strong or weak? Period. Right? It is better to be strong. Yes, it is always better to be strong. Well, then why do women exist? Why do women exist with their life? Because there's a trade-off. There's a cost and a benefit. Okay? A big brain consumes a lot of calories. Big muscles consume a lot of calories. There's a cost to it. Right? I mean, this is so obvious to me. Like, why would that argument fly when regarding, the brain? Of course, it flies regarding the brain because that's their religion. It has to be true. Right? It has to be true. It is one of their basic beliefs. Right? It is social conservatism. And so and going back to the evolution of evolution, you had basically the creationist period. Then you had the early evolutionists who were like the scientific racialists. And scientific racialists and eugenicists. Then you have this period of what I will call the cultural Marxist evolutionists. Or if you think, oh, cultural Marxist, that's a white nationalist term, fine. Equalist evolutionists who believe in racial equality, right? That's what it's about, right? And so you can call them whatever. The racial equality evolutionists. All right, and that's what you have right now. Why do you have the racial equality evolutionists right now? My opinion, World War II and Nazi Germany. Right, you had Nazi Germany doing the hell of it is that the racial theories of the Nazi regime had nothing to do with the racial theories that were popular in the United States and the British Empire. Okay, I mean, so it's completely at odds, right? There's no Aryan race in the British and American literature. There's no Aryan race. Okay, the Nazi scientific racialists were purely political, right? They would find, for example, Hitler needed allies, so they found a way to make the Muslims Aryans, right? Oh yeah, they're Aryan, right? They're warrior people, whatever. They're Aryans. Found a way to, right? Himmler kept trying to find a way to make the Japanese Aryans, and eventually settled on having them be honorary Aryans, right? Whereas with the Slavs, we got to find a way to make them non-Aryan, right? And so they did all just nonsense about Slavs being stupid, which they're not. They're white like Germans, right? So, and of course the biggest enemy were two groups. One was the Jews, and the other was the Slavic peoples. Right, the Slavs were the big enemy, which makes sense because where did Hitler grow up? He grew up in Austria, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the factions, the peoples that were causing the most trouble for the Austro-Hungarian Empire were the Slavic peoples, both within and without the empire. Right, so Hitler's dislike of Slavs can be traced back to his personal experience in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? And that's where Nazi propaganda against the Slavs comes from, right? It comes from that little, pencil dick's hatred of the Slavs when he was growing up in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? Right. That's it. That's the origin. That's the origin of Nazi scientific racial theory. Hitler's bugaboos. Okay. And that, of course, is then used. Right. It's fucking amazing. Right. This guy, this little turd, hated Slavs because of some experience he had with Slavs in Austro-Hungary, and started to hate Jews because of some experience he had with Jews in Vienna. My opinion is he was a prostitute and got screwed over by some Jews really badly, systematically. Because Hitler actually recounts in Mein Kampf that he wasn't always an anti-Semite, that he only became anti-Semitic after he was in Vienna. And of course in the book he talks about, right, that it was a logical thing that he came to, but I think it was a personal experience he had. Anyway, but that's kind of irrelevant. Basically, his bugaboos about Jews and Slavs informed Nazi racial theory. Right. The thing is, Hitler did not have bugaboos about blacks. When, for example, just take the famous example of Jesse Owens. Hitler was very stern, cold-faced to Jesse Owens in public. Did not award him a medal. Of course, Owens got the medal, but Hitler did not award it to him. But then Jesse Owens actually recounts in private that Hitler congratulated him and was very friendly and talked to him very, very nicely. Owens spoke of the German people as being very friendly towards him. So, and this makes sense if you recognize that Nazi racial theory comes from Hitler's personal experiential bugaboos. Hitler, in his personal experience, did not experience many black people, right? There simply weren't hardly any. And so, there was in Mein Kampf, for example, there's a little section where Hitler refers to blacks as being half ape. Right? It's like a paragraph long. Right? But then he goes on to something else that's stupid. But the fact is, Hitler does not. I mean, Hitler was not really anti-black. Right? I mean, he would refer to the French as being negrified, right? As negrified whites, and that the United States was weakened by its Negro element. Okay, but Hitler did not have some existential desire to wipe out blacks. For example, there was no general plan in the East which called for the liquidation of about half of all Slavs. There was no parallel to that regarding the blacks. Okay, right? The hatred was towards the Slavs, right? And that's where the scientific, well, in this case, genuinely pseudoscientific racial theories were directed. They were directed towards the Slavs. But of course, this was then used to say, oh, this is where scientific racialism gets you. So it's bad, right? This is the Nazi idea, right? In fact, you heard that clip from some shithead professor talking about, well, first off, he was straw manning, right? He said, well, the old scientific racialists thought that if you had a bigger brain, you were smarter than someone who had a smaller brain, right? Which is like, I mean, it's. Let me ask the viewer this question: if there's one person over here who has bigger muscles than this other person, is the person with the bigger muscles going to be smarter? Or Freudian slip there. Going to be stronger? Well, probably, but if the guy with the smaller muscles turns out to be stronger, well, it has happened many times, So it's not. I mean, people with bigger muscles tend to be stronger, okay, but it's not a sure thing. So, and that's kind of the same thing with brain size. Well, all else being equal, if someone has a bigger brain, they'll probably be better at various, cognitive functions. Okay, we talk about, for example, the egghead, and prior stereotypes, right? And this is obviously not a scientific thing, but just prior stereotypes. The really really smart people in cartoons had big bulbous heads, right, for big old brains, and the reason I say that is because the correlation between brain size and IQ is really only about like 0.5. So there's plenty of instances with people with bigger brains having higher IQs than people with smaller brains. But if you have like a really, really, really big brain, I mean, unless it's a result of like some sort of deformity, like for example, if you have a really, really big heart, you probably can pump more blood, unless you have enlarged heart syndrome, right? Right? Same thing, like if you have a really, really big brain, well, I think the biggest brain in history actually belongs to someone who had who had like water in the brain, and whose brain kept retaining water, and he was actually mentally retarded. So you'll get things like that. But if he has a really, really big normal brain, or really, really big normal heart, right, they're probably going to pump more blood, and the brain's probably going to do more things, more brain things. Whales have really, really, really big brains. Are they smart? Well, this gets into a definition of what exactly smart means. If you define smart as being able to act like a human, well, okay, then the whale's not very smart. But if you define smart as being able to circumnavigate the globe by dead reckoning in the ocean with no real landmarks, and you can't do that, but a whale can, well, the whale might think that you're stupid. So, it's... And unfortunately, whenever I talk about this stuff, you can't really get into the evolution of humans that well, because as soon as you start talking about the evolution of humans after a certain point. Now you can go, like it's safe to talk about hominids, but once you hit sapiens, that's it. That's where it stops. Right? Evolution stops at sapiens. Right? In the brain. Other parts of the body have obviously continued to evolve. I mean, the visual confirmation is too great. It's too much for a belief. But the brain is still kind of a black box, right? The brain is still, it's not exact. We're not exactly sure how it works. So with the brain, you still have that little window of uncertainty with which you can plug in equality. And so that's kind of what's happening, with scientific research. In what is not known, that is the domain of what is called philosophy, university philosophy, and religion, which, kind of the same thing. But as science expands, the purview of university philosophy and religion shrinks. Okay, and what I'm saying right now is that racial cognitive equality, that's one of these things, because the brain is not 100% known. The genome, we don't know what the genes do. Right? There have been several genome-wide association studies that have found a lower bound heritability estimate of about 0.5 within Western populations. Now, some people may think, aha, so the heritability is only 0.5, not 0.8, as you said before. No. That's what they found, right? Being able to find the genes and their interactions with each other. Because going back to those beads, you have those beads, but those beads produce proteins which then go back and affect the expression of another bead. See? So the overall, so that is why it's so difficult to find the overall heritability. And when all these studies say a general heritability of IQ of about 0.5, about 0.55, they always say that is a lower bound estimate. That is a lower bound estimate. That's what they could find. They didn't find what they didn't find, right? So, and the top-down heritability estimates using twin reared apart studies and which controls the genes to a degree. Actually, as it turns out, that what are called identical twins aren't 100% identical in their gene sets, which actually increases the robustness of the heritability estimates for the twins reared apart inferences, because we now know that there were actually slight genetic differences, and we were assuming 100% genetic similarity, right? Which will reduce how much phenotypic similarity in an identical environment. Thus, the environmentality thus the heritability estimate should actually be a little bit higher. Anyway, so there's those, but there's also the monozygotic and dizygotic twins, right? The dizygotic being non-identical. And what you do is in that you measure how much more similar the identical twins are than the non-identical twins, assuming that they have equal home environment. And that's all you're controlling for. You're controlling for home environment. And they go to the same school, live in the same neighborhood. So you can say that there's a degree of similarity there. And you see just how much more similar the identical twins are than the non-identical twins are, right? So what you're doing there is you're controlling the environment and measuring the effects of greater genetic similarity. In the other, where you have identical twins reared apart, you're controlling for genes and trying to measure a degree of environmental similarity. Or, excuse me, a degree of environmental dissimilarity, right? So, and both of these yield general heritability estimates of about 0.8. So, now the fact that genome-wide association studies repeatedly find general heritability estimates of only about 0.5, well, what does that mean? Does that mean the general heritability is only 0.5? No. The reason I say this is because early on, when researchers tried to do bottom-up estimates, trying to find the genes, at the very beginning they would find estimates like 0.1. Right? Very early on they would find, about 1% can be attributed to genetic differences that we can find, right? So they started off a lot lower, and they have built up to 0.5. And they've kind of hit a wall at 0.5. So you may say, oh, they hit a wall. Well, this is evidence that's the number. Well, maybe. Another problem with these genome-wide association studies is that they haven't been replicated, right? That is, they can do this multiple times in multiple populations, find heritabilities of about 0.5, but it's different genes for different populations that they look at. So what they're basically finding is a whole bunch of positives that can't be replicated. So they're probably false positives. That is the rubric from one study to another cannot be replicated. Yeah, we found, like, this study has found using bottom-up methods a 0.5 heritability, and so has this study, but it's not the same. It's not the same genes in going from one study to another, right? And so I look at that and I say that, yeah, the bottom-up estimates just aren't there, right? Because you can say, well, no, the bottom-up estimates that with a rubric that can be replicated from study to study have found about 0.1, found about 10% of the variance. So that means that IQ is about 0.1 heritable. And I'm just going to look at that and I'm going to say, you're a moron. We have other studies. We have twin studies, right, which say the general heritability is a lot higher. So, and so that's what I'm going to say. Right? And you're going to say, no, it's 90% of all variance in IQ is down to environmental variance. Like, do you really believe that? You really believe that, bozo? All right. And going forward, what you're seeing is a clash between. You're seeing, like, for example, in Galileo, which is kind of a trite example, but whatever. The example can illustrate what I'm trying to say. Galileo said, "Oh no, see, the Earth revolves around the sun. The Earth is not the center." The Church said, "No, no, 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 no." But then Galileo would continue to go on and would say that the Earth is the center of the the sun is the center of the universe. But I'm still a good Catholic. I believe in God. I go to Mass, right? I'm a young Earth creationist, right? All those things were true about Galileo, as far as we know. And that's what you had. That's what Galileo did. Galileo did not go beyond that, right? With Robert Putnam and regime flavor, Robert Putnam says, well, I looked at the populations, and then what I found is that racial diversity leads to decreased social capital, even after he controlled for a bunch of things. Now, in my opinion, like, for example, he controlled for income. He would control for, well, you can go see for yourself what he actually controlled for. But he controlled for several things, and in my opinion, they were spurious controls, right? Because, for example, when you control for, church attendance, for example, he did not control for that. But let's say someone did control for church attendance. Well, is church attendance affected by diversity? Right? If so, then by controlling for church attendance, you are in part controlling for diversity. I.e., I think that Robert Putnam actually controlled for diversity in several of his controls. Right? For example, when you control for, say, TV watching. If you were to control for TV watching, well, is TV watching affected by the racial diversity in an area? If so, then by controlling for TV watching, you are also controlling for the very thing that affects TV watching, right? Because it's gonna dampen both, right? It's gonna completely dampen TV watching, but it's gonna also dampen diversity to the effect that there is a relation between diversity and TV watching. It's not going to dampen the racial diversity as much as the TV watching, which is completely wiped out, but it's going to dampen the diversity a little bit. So I think that Robert Putnam made several spurious controls. But that aside, even after making all these controls, and Robert Putnam is a good liberal, by the way, he found that racial diversity leads to reduced social capital. But then at the end of I don't know all of his papers, but everything I've read, he would always say that this is a challenge to be overcome. Some variation of this is a challenge to be overcome, right? And in the past, I know he has said something to the effect of that he does not wish his work to be used for racist ends. Alfred Binet said the same thing about IQ tests. I don't want my IQ tests to be used for the scientific racialists. And in fact, he actually wrote something that said that it was monstrous that they were being used by the scientific racialists. You can go look up that quote. I don't remember the quote by heart, but he said basically that he did not want the scientific racialists to be using his IQ tests to prove theories of racial superiority. Okay. Of course, and I look at that. I look at Alfred Binet, I look at Robert Putnam, and I look at Galileo as being products of their, their kind of a milieu. I don't know how that's pronounced. I heard it pronounced both ways. And so they have this idea that sort of breaks out, but on the whole, I mean, that's it. They don't break out any further than that, right? Galileo, if Galileo knew that his story would be a perennial thorn against the Catholic Church's credibility, he probably would not have published what he published. If he had known how he would be used, hundreds of years later, he probably would not have published that. Right? And he would probably say something like, I don't want my work to ever be used to question the miracle birth or question any of the Gospels. All right, that's all true. My beef is only with a single issue that the Catholic Church is being adamant on, and I believe that a heliocentric solar system, or not, well, it wasn't called the solar system then, a heliocentric universe is in fact scriptural, right? That's what he would say, right? And he would not want his experience to be used to attack the Catholic Church, right? And to that I say, well, good for you, but it is, right? And it's also another funny thing, like in a much smaller level, you saw the same thing with Evogen, right? Lithidid Man said, I don't want the race realists to be using the popularity of Evogen, who turned out to be a total turd, to be an indictment against racial egalitarianism, right? Well, good for you, okay, but it kind of is, right? Same with Robert Putnam. I don't want my data regarding the shitty living of racially diverse areas, right, of incompatible peoples. He didn't say incompatible peoples. That's what I'm saying. Of different peoples. I don't want that to be used as an argument for racial separation. Well, good for you. Okay? So, And I'm looking at this stuff on evolution, right? And atheism plus people, right? Now, what is atheism plus? The reality is that you have all these YouTube atheists who are attacking atheism plus, but they're all atheism plus, right? Atheism plus is Zom gets Chris, right? Zom gets Chris is atheism plus, right? Concordance is atheism plus. Skeptical heretic is atheism plus. Okay, Coughlin's atheism plus. All these people are atheism plus. So there's no real. I mean, there's not. There's nothing there, right? There's not any difference there. The only thing about atheism plus is that they don't like the idea that it's becoming a formal thing. They like to remain informal, because as soon as you become a formal organization, it's easier to attack, right? There's an advantage and disadvantage. One advantage is that it's easier to attack. The disadvantage is that it's easier to attack, but the advantage is that you have a formal doctrine, right? And so, if you have a formal doctrine, you can make something that's not fucking retarded, right? Whereas if you're just kind of a vague movement, you'll have all sorts of idiots saying all sorts of things who are then used to represent your movement, right? For example, white nationalism, right? White nationalism lacks a formal doctrine. What's the result? Any idiot can get on the net, call himself a white nationalist, say all sorts of stupid fucking shit, and then that's white nationalism. See that, and that's why you need a doctrine, and you need screening, right? You need to screen. This is a certified member. This is not. Okay. Like, no, you're not. You're not a certified. You're not certified competent in the ideology of the movement, right? That's what you need. You need a certification system to say this person is competent to speak, this person is not competent to speak. All right. So this was kind of a meandering video, and the conclusion I want to make is that theories of human biology have changed. They started off with a biblical creationists in the European world. In other places it's different, but in the European world, it started off with biblical creationist. It then went into the scientific racialist evolutionist period. Now we have racial egalitarian evolutionism, and this is difficult because now that is hitting, because it has an idea, evolution, which is at its core against racial egalitarianism. So there's a bit of a contradiction there, right? And the contradiction that came from the political environment following World War II, right? And so there's a contradiction there, that evolution is fundamentally at odds with racial egalitarianism. So this contradiction will this eventually be ironed out? I don't know. They've been able to sustain it for a very long time. So I would like to say, yeah, it's all going to come falling down, come crashing down. But another problem is that it may come crashing down, but by the time it comes crashing down, it may not even matter because whites will probably be a minority by then, right? And of course, blacks, they're going to believe all sorts. I mean, blacks and mestizos, I don't really even consider as part of the discussion, right? These are people to whom these ideological forces don't apply. They're just kind of, black power, God, and then some folksy ideas about the death penalty, right? That's black politics in a nutshell. So none of this stuff that I'm talking about is. I talk about people believe X, and there's these phases of ideological effects. I'm really talking about white people. For black people, it's a much simpler things that are going on there. Okay. So yeah, that's really it. Kind of a long video. If you don't want to watch it, if you didn't watch it this far, I don't really blame you. I'm actually making the video and I'm kind of lost, so I'll just end it.